My role in these closings each year is to talk about what's missing. And I want to try to do that. But first, I'll just say what I love most about this conference is the field of dreams element, which is we kind of thought if we built it, people would come. And thanks to all of you, it happened. And one of the most frequent questions that I've gotten over the past day plus is, why don't we talk about the research that's going on at Wharton? And I think we have two answers to that. One is that we've been in a curating role, and we're trying to bring together the greatest minds, leaders, and thinkers in people analytics and let them share ideas and help facilitate that. But two, we were also trying to figure out what stakes do we want to put in the ground. And we spent a lot of time canvassing what is people analytics really missing? What's not being done enough? And so as we move our initiative forward, there are three topics that we're really excited to focus on. One is behavior change and trying to figure out how we can help people engage in actions that are more productive, that allow them to design more meaningful, more enjoyable jobs, that help them learn, that help them save for retirement. And I don't think there's enough work on this topic. Two is careers, trying to figure out how people's careers are changing, how they can navigate them more effectively. And then three is collaboration and culture. How do you help people work together more effectively? And how do you change a culture from the bottom or the middle if it's not working the way that you want? And you can expect to see more on all those topics from us. But I think there's some big questions that I'm left with after listening over the past 24 hours plus. And I want to highlight three big things that at least I'm going to spend some months thinking about, and I hope some of you will too. I'm going to come at this a little bit from a positive psychology perspective, and I'm going to do that with a little bit of ambivalence, because full disclosure, I don't really believe in having a field of positive psychology. I think we should be neutral as social scientists, and we should study the full range of phenomena. We should study how good things can have bad consequences and vice versa. But I think as a lens, there are some things that we maybe can shed light on, using positive psychology as a frame that otherwise might be missing. So the first thing is, we've heard a lot today, yesterday, about reducing defensiveness and how, we like data until the data disagree with our intuitions or our beliefs and values. And then we like to shove the data aside and pretend they don't exist. And I know no one in this room has ever done that, but you all have constituents who have those tendencies. And I don't think it's enough to just ask, how do we reduce that defensiveness? I think if you were to look at this from a positive psychology perspective, you would actually ask, how do we create a situation where people experience joy at finding out that they were wrong? Imagine, I remember seeing an episode of Frasier once, where Frasier sort of stared out at the camera and he said, "But I have a degree from Harvard. Every time I'm wrong, the world makes a little less sense." And he was just so puzzled at the idea that he could say something that might not be true, given his educational background. And I think we could take that sense of being surprised and push it a little further. Can you imagine people saying, wow, these data totally violated everything I thought to be true. This is fascinating. I would love to learn more about that. How cool that I was wrong. This is an opportunity for learning. And I think we should push to try to create those reactions and understand them. Not just make people less defensive, but try to stimulate excitement about discovering that their beliefs and their knowledge were incomplete. And that's something I think we could contribute as a field that we don't know anything about today. Second thing is, we've talked a ton about diversity, and that's been mostly about reducing biases. I don't think that's enough either. I don't want to just see prejudice go away. And I started wondering this morning, what's the opposite of prejudice? Is it affinity? Is it liking? Is it empathy? And then I remember this work by Todd Patinsky, where he coined the term allophilia, which is love of the other or love of the outgroup. And I wonder, how could we cultivate that? Is it possible that we wouldn't just make people's defense mechanisms, biases, discrimination even go away, but we could actually lead people to have positive attitudes toward those that might be underrepresented or members of minority groups in one shape or form? And I think it's doable. And it starts with an Adam Galinsky data point, which basically says that many of the gender and race differences that we see in the world are really power differences, or at least they're driven heavily by being systematically in positions where you lack power, which is why you see very different reactions among non-dominant groups than you do dominant groups in all kinds of situations. And so I guess the question I would pose here is it possible for us to help people empathize and identify with outgroup members, with groups that have historically faced a lot of discrimination and marginalization, by allowing them to experience powerlessness? And should that happen more often? So here's a simple example that resonates for me based on a recent experience I had. Can I ask all the white men in the room to stand up, please? Okay, what I'd like you to do now is stay standing if you've ever been the only white man in a room, and the rest of you sit down, please. It's a surprisingly good number of you. You can all have a seat now. I'm done with you. I will say that last year, for the first time in my life, I was in a room where I was the only white man. And that happened about 30 years later than it should have. And it was the first time that I ever really thought about what it must feel like to be a token in a way that was not academic, that was not intellectual, that was emotional, where I felt like I didn't belong, like I didn't have a place in that particular room. And I think everybody ought to go through that experience, and I think it ought to happen pretty often. I don't think we should limit it to surface diversity. I think it should also be applied to deep diversity. Try being the only salesperson in a room of engineers, right? That's a little uncomfortable, and not just because they're engineers. And I think that if we start to think a little bit more creatively about how we create experiences that would lead people to really empathize and start to at least understand for a day what it's like to live every day as a member of a minority group, I think we'd make some real progress on diversity issues. So that would be the second thing that I would highlight. And then the last thing is, part of my quibble with positive psychology is I worry a lot about too much of a good thing. I worry about how there's nothing that I've ever been able to come across in the fields of management, in psychology, or in any of our allied social science disciplines where you can actually just assume that more is better. Every strength, every virtue, every desirable intervention, if you push it too far, starts to have negative consequences. You all know a lot about choice overload and the risks of having too much freedom. We have good data on what happens when you're too generous and you're more likely to burn out. We know that there's cognitive entrenchment that comes from being too expert and knowing too much about a field that blinds you to seeing things that you might otherwise notice that need to be questioned. And I think one of the things we ought to do is we ought to ask, what are the factors that we're selecting on? What are the performance metrics that we're evaluating? That in fact, it's possible not just to have too little of those, but also too much. And I guess my pet construct today that I will throw under the bus, because I've heard about it a lot, is growth mindset. I've literally never heard anyone say that growth mindset is other than a good thing. And I don't believe that there's any construct that's universally positive. I think that all good things have unintended consequences and side effects. And I guess the question then is, what are those side effects for growth mindset? And I'll offer two, at least preliminary hypotheses. First one is, I worry a lot about people having a growth mindset over-adapting to the world around them. George Bernard Shaw said once, I think really eloquently, that the reasonable person will adapt him or herself to the world, whereas the unreasonable person will adapt the world to him or herself, and therefore all progress depends on the unreasonable. And if you have a growth mindset, you are eminently reasonable. You are constantly trying to figure out, how do I develop new skills? How do I, create a situation that, maybe is not well designed, but is going to work for me? And I think that oftentimes people with a fixed mindset who think, I can't change that much, those are the people who actually push their organizations to change. They're the people who question practices that don't make sense, who redesign bad jobs, who rewrite job descriptions, not assuming that everybody can just mold and bend to those. And I think there may be a real cost of cultivating growth mindsets, because we may reduce the likelihood that people create change in the world around them. The other thing that I worry about a lot with growth mindset comes from some new research that Oleg Erminsky just published, which is pretty fascinating. What he finds is that the more your mindset is fixed, the more similar you feel today to your future self. And as a result, the more you engage in really good, thoughtful, long-term focused decision-making. You know that yourself today is the same person you're going to be 20 years from now. So you save for retirement because you really care about your current version of yourself being able to survive after you no longer have a job. You end up eating healthier because you feel a strong connection to this person who's going to exist in the future. Whereas people with a stronger growth mindset, they're like, I have no idea who I'm going to be in 20 years, so I can eat whatever I want. Screw that guy. And I think that's a potential cost, right? The more flexible you are, the more you could literally be anyone down the road. And I think that may have some interesting consequences for the kinds of choices that you make. So I throw that out just as a simple example of the kinds of things that we should be focusing on more, the kinds of questions we should be asking. anytime you have a trait that you're selecting on, a measure that you think represents high performance, I think it's worth asking, what happens if we push that too far? And what does it mean to have too much of that? And then how can we understand better how to manage those costs and consequences? Those are a couple of things that I'll be thinking about. As we wrap, I just want to do a few thank yous. First one is huge thanks to Cade Massey, my co-conspirator in making this conference happen. Thank you, Cade. Secondly, our core staff in Wharton People Analytics. Laura Zero, our senior director, Dina Gromay, and Reb Rebeli, our research leads. Thank you. Third, our student team. We had an extraordinary trio leading the charge and many others who are helping them. Can I have all the students who help with the conference please stand up for applause? And in particular, I want to thank Talia, Jonathan, and Gabrielle for the amazing work they did. And finally, thanks to all you. 4 years ago, we weren't sure if this field existed. You've made it pretty clear that it does, and we're thrilled to be helping to build it with you. Thank you.